Hi, Rod Driver. Welcome back to 10 by 6.
Thank you very much for having me on again.
This week, we're looking at war crimes. Nice, pleasant topic. And we're going to focus on, I guess, the obvious culprits in terms of George Bush Jr. and Tony Blair. We're also going to bring it forward to the likes of Barack Obama, David Cameron, and Hilary Clinton. So we'll try and encompass at some point towards the end as well, just a little mention of the present situation in Afghanistan and how it ties in. But over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction. So I think that the place to start here is with the terrorist attacks of September the 11th, 2001. So most viewers will probably be aware that terrorists flew aeroplanes into buildings in New York and in the Pentagon in the United States. And since then, the United States has had a very, very aggressive foreign policy, and it's been sort of blatant. It's out in the open, you know, it's not really hidden. So the first reaction, if you like, to those terrorist attacks was when George W. Bush, the US president at the time, decided that he was going to invade Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan's always been a very important nation in terms of its sort of strategic positioning in Central Asia. So it's often been considered what's called the central location in the grand chessboard. So various countries over the years vying for power in the region because of oil and gas deposits and the ability to build communications through there. So these days that particularly means pipelines for oil and gas. Now, after the terrorist attacks, the justifications that George Bush and Tony Blair gave for attacking Afghanistan at the time were firstly to catch Osama bin Laden, who was the person that is believed to have carried out the terrorist attacks. And then also they put forward a humanitarian angle, which was to replace the Taliban, who were the rulers of Afghanistan then, because they had such a terrible human rights record. But these justifications didn't really stack up at the time. So many people were aware that most of the terrorists from 9/11 actually came from Saudi Arabia. And although they may at the time the attacks took place, in fact, they had plenty of warning that the attacks were coming. And therefore the senior people would have had the opportunity to move away from Afghanistan if they wanted to. And the thing about the Taliban is that when they were sort of attacked by the Americans, in fact, they were simply replaced by violent warlords. So the human rights record in Afghanistan did not improve very much. But there's much more going on behind the scenes that people need to be aware of. So in fact, the United States government had been negotiating with the Taliban to build pipelines through Afghanistan throughout the 1990s. And that had gone on right up until approximately July 2001, where talks weren't really proceeding very well. And so the Americans threatened to bury the Taliban under a carpet of bombs. And so, in fact, the terrorist attacks of 2001 simply gave the Americans the excuse they needed to carry out an attack that they've been wanting to carry out anyway to try to take control of Afghanistan. And what was notable is that immediately after the American attacks, the first US representative in the country was a senior person connected to the oil industry. So one of the things we've discovered in the last few years through WikiLeaks, which is probably the best source of information about wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, is just the scale of the deaths. So actually, the people at WikiLeaks wrote a piece of software to go through all of the reports that had been released to them from a whistleblower and added up how many people in Afghanistan had been killed directly by American soldiers. And the total came to hundreds of thousands. So the death toll in Afghanistan is almost never reported on, but it's really huge. And people are aware that most deaths in war in general tend to be disease and things like that. So in fact, the total death toll in Afghanistan may well be much higher. But no one will ever know, because no one's ever going to do a proper estimate. So that was the immediate response to September the 11th. And then 2 years later, in 2003, Britain and America attacked Iraq. Now, I'll just tell you a little bit about the history of Iraq so people understand the context. So Britain and America overthrew the leadership of Iraq in 1963, so that the country was then controlled by their, what you might call their puppet or their client regime. And Saddam Hussein took control with the blessing of Britain and America in 1979. And he was always a brutal dictator. This was never about human rights. But Britain and America supplied weapons to him for many, many decades. And so during the 1980s, there was, some people will remember the Iran-Iraq war, where Britain and America were supplying both sides in that war. So in 1991, we had something that was called Gulf War I. Now, Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi military invaded the neighboring country of Kuwait. And H.W. Bush stated at the time that he wanted to prevent a dictator from seizing control of a quarter of the world's oil reserves. So he then went to attack Iraq. Now, in fact, there had been negotiations about having a sort of peaceful end to this. And the Iraqis had agreed to withdraw from Kuwait and were doing so when the Americans attacked. So the Americans were not interested in peaceful resolutions. So they just wanted to mostly destroy the Iraqi military, but they left Saddam Hussein in power. Now, if we jump ahead to 2003, so this is the main invasion that we're talking about today. Some people label this Gulf War II, but in fact, in the period between 1 and 2, there was about 12 years where Britain and America were bombing Iraq approximately once every 3 days. So in fact, this was always a continuation of the same war. And immediately after the second phase in 2003, the American military secured the oil fields and the Ministry of Oil, but not much else. So there's complete chaos in much of the country. Now, I'm going to talk in more detail about Iraq because that's the one we have most information on. So we were given a great deal of propaganda to justify the attack on Iraq. So we were told that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a future presentation, because weapons of mass destruction is a propaganda term. So most people, when they hear the phrase, they picture a mushroom cloud, a nuclear weapon destroying a whole city in the blink of an eye. In fact, what Saddam Hussein had was, at worst, was chemical battlefield shells that would have been degraded from many years earlier. So in fact, these are not what any normal person would think of as a weapon of mass destruction. In fact, they're really no more dangerous than conventional weapons. So there was a second bit of propaganda, which was about Saddam Hussein being connected to the terrorists. But in fact, that was always unlikely because he ran a secular government and was very opposed to the terrorist organizations and so on. And then there was the idea of a humanitarian intervention. Well, that was slightly contradicted by the fact that we'd supported him for decades, giving him weapons whilst he had committed some of his most brutal atrocities earlier on. And we were given repeated lies. So we were told that he was trying to buy nuclear material in Africa. It turned out that all the documents related to that were forgeries. And the final document was something that most people will have heard of, called the Dodgy Dossier, which was a sort of stitched together fake dossier purporting to be about weapons of mass destruction. And the media repeated this without any serious scrutiny. But in fact, most people have realized since that time that this was complete junk. So millions of people protested against the invasion of Iraq. So this is quite interesting because this was one of those examples where the propaganda had not worked. Most people knew that the propaganda was not true, and there was no real justification for attacking Iraq. But what we see is that the government was able to ignore these millions of protesters. So you start to realize that we need to start talking more about the idea of power, that ordinary people actually have very little power to influence government if the government is set on its course. And a great deal of information has come out from government insiders over the years explaining all the propaganda. So George Tenet, the former head of the CIA, that's America's intelligence agency, he actually briefed George Bush that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And intelligence insiders in both Britain and America have admitted that the intelligence was fixed around the plan. That means that Britain and America were going to do the invasion, and they said to these intelligence experts, even if you haven't got any evidence to justify this attack, we want you to go back to the evidence and make it look as if we've got evidence to justify this attack. And the governments in both countries actually threatened intelligence insiders that their careers were on the line if they could not get better information to justify the attacks. And there's a very famous note that was written by Donald Rumsfeld, so a senior person in the US government, on the day of the 9/11 attacks. And he wrote, "Best info fast. Judge whether good enough hit SH," meaning Saddam Hussein, at same time. Not only UBL, meaning Osama bin Laden, the terrorist. Sweep it all up, things related and not. So we can see very clearly from this single note that senior people in the US government were trying to find any way they could to use the terrorist attacks to justify attacking Saddam Hussein and Iraq. And in fact, the CIA have done very serious investigations to try and link the 9/11 attacks to Saddam Hussein, and they were never able to come up with any attack. And bizarrely, although Tony Blair was one of the people who led the way in wanting the attack on Iraq, he's actually admitted various things since then that make you realize what was going on. So he's admitted that the vice president in America, Dick Cheney, wanted forcible regime change in all Middle East countries that were hostile to US interests. And this was many years earlier. And the former General Wesley Clark actually had conversations with Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense in the US at the time, where they wanted to overthrow the governments of 7 countries in 5 years. So that was Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Sudan, which has also been split up, Somalia, which has been devastated, Lebanon, and Iran. So whilst it didn't happen in 5 years, many of those countries were ultimately attacked. Now, the best estimate of the death toll in Iraq recently is probably close to 2.5 million. Again, nobody will know the figures for sure. Whenever these high figures come out, government ministers often come forward and say, oh, well, we have doubt about those numbers. It's a PR strategy to cast doubt on something. But in fact, we have evidence that when earlier very high estimates were coming out, that in fact, government specialists were advising the government ministers that those high figures probably were correct. So when politicians come forward and say, oh, I doubt those very high figures, that's always a smokescreen. It's just PR. They know that those are the best estimates. And what we see in Iraq is the country sort of fell apart and turned into regional power bases where different religious groups would take control in different regions. So there was ethnic cleansing, there was mass emigration. So it's best to see those 2 wars and the ones we're going to talk about in a minute, all part of a general strategy of US imperialism and control of energy resources, particularly oil and gas. So if we leap ahead then to Barack Obama. Now, when Barack Obama came into power in 2009, the vast majority of people thought that he would be far, far better, far less violent in his foreign policy than the previous American politicians. In fact, he was no better. And at one point, he actually practically boasted of having bombed 7 countries. So the war in Afghanistan was extended into Pakistan. He was involved in attacking Somalia. And he was the person who drove forward the drone assassination programs, which, although you might initially think that a drone assassination is about trying to assassinate a terrorist, in fact, they kill so many innocent people that they end up recruiting large numbers of terrorists. So he was incredibly violent in his foreign policies. So if you look at what happened in 2011, there was a general thing happening in the area in the Middle East called the Arab Spring. And there are a number of countries involved here, but if you look at, say, the ones that were backed by the United States, so that would be Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, countries where the governments had very, very bad human rights records. What was happening was that genuine protesters were protesting against the government. Now, those protesters got no assistance whatsoever from Britain and America. In fact, Britain and America continued supporting the leaderships there, who were mostly able to stop the protests, not entirely, but mostly. In Libya and Syria, we have eyewitness accounts that say something very different was going on, that this was not peaceful protesters, this was violent extremists. So if we look at Libya, so Britain and America attacked Libya in 2011, and although representatives from the British and American governments often claim, oh, we weren't really involved in that. That was mostly sort of terrorists and uprisings and sort of people in the region. In fact, Britain and America flew 26,000 bombing raids in 2011. That's an enormous amount of bombs being dropped on one country. So in fact, Britain and America were actively there. So they had their military specialists helping on the ground, and they were doing a huge amount of air support. So there was huge slaughter, huge displacement, lots of ethnic cleansing. And the propaganda with Libya was quite interesting. So we even had stories that were repeated by the human rights organizations saying that the leader in Libya, Gaddafi, was giving Viagra to his soldiers to encourage them to rape all the women they came across. And in fact, it turned out to be complete nonsense. There was no evidence about this at all. And the other propaganda that was put forward was that the attack on Libya would avert a massacre that Gaddafi had planned. Now, not very many people were critical of this propaganda at the time, but one or two, like John Pilger, who's been an outstanding writer for decades, said, oh, this is just the same old propaganda, this is nonsense. And in fact, in 2016, the British Parliament had an investigation into this and found that there was no evidence that any massacre was planned and that the attacks had anything to do with averting a massacre. So once again, we can turn to WikiLeaks to find out what was really going on. So 250,000 documents that were classified at the time, but were leaked by whistleblowers to WikiLeaks. So many of them talk about oil as a key concern for Britain, America, and also France in the region. It's really important to understand Britain and America are not the only two advanced nations that commit serious crimes in other countries. France actively commits crimes in countries where it used to be the imperial power about half a century ago. So we actually have emails about what the French leadership were thinking. So this was Sarkozy, and he was communicating with Hilary Clinton, who it's believed was the main sort of person driving the attack on Libya. And the emails talk about Sarkozy's motivation wanting to attack Libya. And the reasons given were these. It was access to Libyan oil reserves, for French firms to be rewarded with contracts, to increase Sarkozy's reputation domestically, which I always think is kind of laughable, but actually having an overseas war has often throughout history been a method for a ruler to increase his standing domestically. And the final reason was very important. So to ensure French influence in the region and to prevent Gaddafi's influence in French-speaking parts of Africa, in particular, to stop the creation of an African currency that would replace the dominant French franc and would help to unify Africa. Now, most people know nothing about this. So Gaddafi actually had an incredibly positive role in Africa. He'd actually started putting up satellites that were enabling Africa to have communications. So phone, TV, radio, long distance, without having to pay massive fees to European countries, which is where they used to get their satellites from. He'd also tried to set up an African monetary fund and African banks and to set up a French currency, to set up an African currency. And this was for two reasons. One is the French currency is used in many parts of Africa, and it strangles development. It enables the French and French companies to dominate what's going on in many of those countries. But also things like oil and other African resources that are mined there are traded in US dollars. And Gaddafi wanted to start trading everything, such as oil, in the new African currency. And that would transform the balance of power and the relationship between America and Europe and Africa. It would give Africa much more control of its own resources and its own wealth. And the Americans and the French really did not want that. So the Gaddafi would have insisted that oil was traded in the new currency and not the US dollar. So the Americans had that motive for removing Gaddafi, but they also, we've seen from other documents, they were interested in boosting Obama's popularity. And there's one other thing that stands out from the files that we've seen is that everybody understood that removing Gaddafi would increase terrorism, that he actually played an important role in stabilizing the region. The governments of Britain, America, and France understood that the opposition to Gaddafi was violent. It was not moderate, it was not ordinary peaceful protesters, but they went ahead anyway. And the final thing to note about this is that Gaddafi's son was trying to negotiate a peaceful discussion about how to resolve this, and Hillary Clinton was not interested. So we see this time and time again that the Americans actively want war. They don't try to avoid war. And the other thing to bear in mind about Iraq and Libya is that before America and Britain, and in the case of Libya, France, destroyed them, they were virtually first world countries. They just about reached the level where you would say, actually, it's a first world standard of living. So, so we are destroying quite advanced nations some of the time. Okay, if we look at one of the other countries that Barack Obama attacked, that's Syria. And Americans have admitted that from 2007 onwards, so this is a long time before the attacks began, they admitted they were trying to create what they labeled as a militant front of extremists. That's actually a euphemism from an army of terrorists. And that would be created not just by the Americans, but by the Saudis and by the Israeli government. So this is a proxy army. And we see this over and over again in US foreign policy, that the Americans won't always use the militaries in its entirety. They'll often have a few specialists supporting a proxy army. So that's groups of other people who will do the fighting for them. So America and Britain supported with bombs and missiles. The CIA have a huge budget for training these terrorists and providing weapons for these terrorists. And probably America would have been successful in overthrowing the Syrian government if it had not been for the fact that Russia stepped in from 2015 onwards and helped to protect the Syrian government. Now, it's estimated that there have been about 400,000 deaths in Syria. Again, we won't know the true figure, and parts of it are still in chaos. Now, the propaganda with Syria was very successful. And so the mainstream media repeated propaganda about the use of chemical weapons. But we know that various whistleblowers from the organization that investigates chemical weapons, that's the OPCW, they've actually come forward and said, look, what you're seeing in the media, that is not what we investigated. That's not what we witnessed on the ground. And it seems highly likely that the Syrian leader Gaddafi did not actually use chemical weapons. The whistleblowers are suggesting that they were actually used by the opposition, who were trying to use a sort of fake issue of chemical weapons to draw America and Britain into the war. Now, the British government frequently tries to say that it has no involvement in Syria, but in fact, it was just manipulating things. So it actually loaned pilots to the Canadian Air Force so that, operating under the sort of Canadian flag, our pilots could be involved in the war. And in fact, various analyses have shown that UK involvement in Syria has actually been worse than UK involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it is very large scale. And there's one other element of propaganda that's worth mentioning in relation to Syria, that the British government has actively funded citizen journalists in Syria who are critical of their government. So they're actually getting local people to do the propaganda for them. So it's incredibly difficult, even if you see things now on the internet, which say, hey, I'm a local person living in Syria and this is what's going on. You can't know for sure that that's true, because many of those people are being funded by people who want to overthrow the government. Okay, so the final country I want to mention just briefly is Yemen. So mostly Saudi Arabia has been using its military to destroy Yemen since 2015. But in fact, the scale of weapon supplies from America, Britain, and France, and the scale of the expertise that we have provided to enable those weapons to be used, suggests that actually this is not a war driven by the Saudi government. This is a war, again, driven by US and British imperialism, using the Saudis as, again, a proxy army. And the displacement of people in Yemen has been one of the biggest human rights catastrophes this century. So millions and millions of people have been displaced and needed aid. Hospitals have actually been targeted by the bombs that the Saudis have been dropping. So whenever I try and investigate any of these situations in detail and find out who are the different players on the ground, who are the people in the different parts of Yemen who are interested in one thing or another, you realize that the whole situation is incredibly complex, and it shifts and so on, and it changes all the time. And a group of people who are working together often become enemies and work with a different group of people and so on. So the key thing to understand about Yemen is that Britain, US, and France are very actively involved in destroying and attacking that country. And it seems quite likely that this is similar to the other attacks, where they're all part of a general strategy by the United States government to control oil resources and strategic regions in the area. So the outcome in all these 5 countries is chaos throughout much of the country. And the general pattern is overthrowing governments that had been targeted for many years by the Americans. So governments that will not structure their economies in a way that will work for American companies to control the wealth of those countries. And the propaganda is very consistent. They present the leader of the country, so that could be Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, Assad, it could be the Taliban. They're presented as almost like the devil. You know, the propaganda is quite extreme, that these people are the most evil person you can imagine, and we, the good old British and American white knights, have to go and save these countries. And of course, none of this is true. And these days, sometimes in the academic writing about these things, instead of using the term humanitarian intervention, writers will use the term R2P. That stands for responsibility to protect. So Britain and America will claim we have a responsibility to protect people in other countries. But it's just propaganda again. The fact that we are supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia whilst they are destroying Yemen indicates quite clearly that humanitarian interventions are not a serious issue in US or British foreign policy. And in fact, there have been many surveys that show that outside Britain and America, the vast majority of people in most countries are fully aware that the United States is the biggest threat to peace all over the world. Now, that's the 2 sort of posts that I'd written, and that was quite a nice summary up to the time. There's 2 things I want to just extend a little bit. The first is that in approximately 2014, America massively scaled up its bombing attacks in these countries. So many of these countries, for periods, they disappear from the news. So for many years, Afghanistan was not mentioned much in the news. But even when it's not being mentioned, America is frequently dropping enormous quantities of bombs on these countries, and it's just never talked about. So 2014 onwards, the scale of the assault by America in many of these regions was enormous, just flattening whole cities at a time. So if we then leap forward to the present day, what we've seen recently in the news is that America has carried out a withdrawal from Afghanistan. And just recently, we've been seeing that the Taliban appear to be regaining control of Afghanistan. Now, this is actually quite a complex issue, and it's quite fluid. Things are happening very quickly. And there's a number of interesting points about it. Firstly, the American withdrawal is only a partial withdrawal. So they still have many people in the region. So it's not entirely clear what their goals are. Then at the same time, China is much more powerful now than it was back in 2001 when America first attacked. And it's taking a much greater interest in what's going on in countries around it and in that region. And so from what we can tell, we believe that the Chinese government are now in talks with the Taliban about establishing a proper government there. Now, only time will tell what the outcome of these negotiations is and what the role of the Americans in the country is. So I would love to be able to tell you exactly what's going on right this minute in Afghanistan, but I always say to people, it's very, very hard as events are developing so quickly to know for sure what's going on. It's a sort of watch this space. So that brings us right up to date, Jason.
Fantastic, Rod. Thank you so much. And yeah, again, so much is swirling around and so many things that could or should be said. The trouble is, I think it goes back again to the core of who is promoting and who's repeating over and over and over this propaganda, these ideas, and why very people who are responsible for repeating the propaganda haven't gone the other way and are trying to establish the reality so that if we call ourselves a democracy, the information that we get is credible, is valid, is in essence factual. But it doesn't seem to work like that. So it almost, you talked very early on about the millions of people who came out and demonstrated against Iraq, and yet it made no difference because the government have already determined what course of action they were going to take. So almost we've got to a point now, I think, where why do they even bother the propaganda? Why don't they just do what they want to do? Because they are effectively, and we call it, liberal democracy. We call it, so-called better than a lot of other countries. But in fact, being better than another country doesn't make it in any way fit for purpose. And what we effectively have is the occasional opportunity to vote, and our actual individual vote doesn't seem to make any much difference anyway, if at all. So why don't they just do it? Why don't they scrub the corporate media? Don't bother to give them all this rubbish to keep repeating over and over again. Just do it.
Well, I think that's a really good question. So strangely enough, in future programs, we'll talk more about the media and about propaganda. And in fact, one of the best forms of, I'll call it propaganda, but it's sort of using it in a slightly odd way, is to just not talk about something. And there is a kind of general thing of what I call censorship by omission. So the most important form of propaganda is just to not talk about a topic, or to talk about it in a very narrow way where you don't give lots of other alternative views, which might actually be perfectly reasonable opinions. But in fact, in the past, when governments have been able to get away with not mentioning something, they have done that. So if you look at, there was in 2006, America secretly invaded Somalia alongside the Ethiopian government. Now, there was almost no mention of America's presence in this at all. It just disappeared. And so there are situations where America does this. And in fact, in an earlier attack on Panama, the war was over before anybody even knew about it. This was back in the 1990s. So not talking about it is one way to do it. I think there is an issue that because of modern communications technology, some information does emerge from other countries and so on to contradict the mainstream narrative. So I think the people in power do feel that they would find it incredibly difficult if they didn't say things to justify what's going on. I think it may well be the case that if they said nothing and just went about basically ruling the world, which is essentially what they do, possibly people might start to organize against them. Whereas there's a standard thing with PR and spin that you don't need to provide evidence of what's going on. You just need to put a little bit of doubt in the mind of anybody who's watching. And the vast majority of people are not that interested in foreign policy. They're so busy with their everyday lives and they're so stressed with their everyday lives that if there's a little bit of doubt about what's going on, they're happy to trust their government and let them get on with stuff. So I think probably there's a feeling that that a little bit of propaganda works better than saying nothing at all. But if they could get away with saying nothing at all, if it's something that happens over a short period of time, I think they will probably do that as well. But one day, wouldn't it be great if we could have somebody who is a spin doctor today, who wants in the future to give us chapter and verse on what is actually going through the minds of these people when they're doing propaganda. We just need the highest level whistleblowers to come forward and tell us what's going on. But strangely enough, we rarely get very high level whistleblowers. And this is something that really interests me. And this is something that Craig Murray, the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, who exposed the torture in Uzbekistan, he tried to expose it. And what he found was that nobody else would kind of join with him in saying this torture is terrible. They all were just interested in their careers. And my wife actually works with a whistleblower organization, and they work with thousands of whistleblowers, but they said the proportion of high-level whistleblowers is incredibly small. They understand that their career, their self-esteem, their self-worth is dependent on just buying into the narrative. And Craig Murray, sorry, John.
So, I was going to say, do you think that also fear plays a crucial role as to why they don't whistleblow at that level? Because it's not just about the material things that they've got to lose. There's other things that they can lose as well.
Well, so I think fear does play a role, and every once in a blue moon, something very bizarre appears in the news. So decades ago, there was a banker found hung under a bridge in London. And then very much more recently, there was a body of an MI6 agent found in a suitcase, and just really weird things. And if you kind of look through history at people who've been assassinated, you realize that the intelligence services in various countries will assassinate people right up to the highest level. So I think there was the leader of Sweden about 30 years ago who wanted to have a sort of much more left-wing government that was not entirely in line with American wishes. He was assassinated. Now, we can never know for sure the details of these things, but there have been so many assassinations over the years that I think you're right. There is an element of fear that these people know the lengths that the intelligence services will go to control the situation. That there probably is an element of that. But interestingly enough, we'd need a whistleblower to admit that, to know that for sure. So it's slightly speculative, and it's very hard to know with any certainty.
Yes, no, absolutely. So we've run upon a very small number of people who are brave enough, but probably aren't that vulnerable, given that there are so few of them. It's when everything starts to escalate and a lot more people come to the fore and start to tell us what's really going on, that the state probably then has to clandestinely find a strategy to prevent this.
Yeah,
it was interesting as well, because I was thinking again about the media, and I looked at some of the stuff that's been coming out, and CNN have been criticised, and obviously CNN are an extremely powerful corporate propaganda machine in themselves. but they've been criticised because the initial response to the evacuation of Kabul was about, oh, what about the women and children? You know, what's the dramatic effect now that the Taliban and the fundamentalist faith that they believe in, the impact that that will have. And of course, that was a wash for 24 or 36 hours. And then there's been a switch in the last 24 hours, again, by CNN, I'm just giving this as a case study, to the amount of lithium that you can find to be mined in Afghanistan, and how supposedly combating climate change because of rechargeable batteries demands lithium. And therefore, you know, the criticism has been, you know, they've already moved away from humanitarianism in such a short space of time now to another propaganda project, which is obviously the zeitgeist, the buzzword of the moment, which is climate change. And it's all happening really rapidly. It's not like it's, you know, let's really do something about helping women in there, and when we've overcome that problem, we'll move on to something else. It's it's really, really rapid, really, really quick, because I think it's playing to the consciousness of people now in 2021, where their concentration levels are effectively much, much less than they were when they spent a lot of time reading books and journals, in a physical sense. So it's like a machine gun, like that.
Yeah.
And then we've gone from women to lithium, and goodness knows what by the end of the weekend we'll be on.
So this is actually something that I've noticed in sort of one or two other stories. So when we were doing the Libya stuff, so the thing about the Viagra rape story, that kind of came and then went quite quickly, but it sticks in people's consciousness, and you know, once it's kind of imprinted, people don't forget it. So when they do this chopping and changing with the propaganda, it's very, very hard to know quite what the strategy is. And the very interesting thing about US foreign policy, about the US government in general, is it's a very, very big organization. And in fact, there was a journalist called Greg Palast who investigated what was going on in Iraq many years ago, because the strategy in Iraq seemed to keep changing about, did they want control of this region for the oil? Did they want that? And it turned out that there were different departments in the US government who actually felt that they wanted different strategies. And depending on who was the sort of dominant person or the dominant department in policy making at any given moment, strategy would change related to that person's wishes and the interests of the department and the sort of corporate backers that those departments had. So sometimes the White House and the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security and the CIA, they're not all working from the same playbook. And they're all putting out different press releases through different sets of contacts in the media. And some of these may not appear to be entirely consistent, or they might be entirely different strands. And so it can be incredibly hard to work out what is going on in real time, because there's so much manipulation going on behind the scenes that you have no idea what is just a press release, what is just a bit of propaganda, what has been made up, what is a spokesman in a country who's being paid by the American government or the British government. You just can't tell. And it doesn't matter how informed somebody is, even people who spend their lives researching one country and even living in that country find it hard to know for sure what's going on. If you imagine somebody who lives in Britain and specializes in British politics and reports on British politics all the time, that's all they've done all their lives, still they won't know what's going on behind the scenes of every group of conservative politicians, of every group of Labour politicians, of the CIA, not the CIA, MI6 and MI5 and so on. So it's impossible to know the detail. And so you can never be sure what's going on. So you just have to sort of observe, listen to different reports coming from different groups of people, weigh it up for yourself. But to some extent, we are slightly passive bystanders who just get to witness what goes on and wait to see. And what we can try to do in the longer term is influence the general policy of our government and try to have governments that don't want to do war. And so that, we should be trying to influence the British government to stop invading other countries. And we would hope that American people will try to influence their government to stop invading other countries. But at the moment, that doesn't seem very likely, unfortunately.
And we seem to have gone full circle in terms of this conversation as well, in terms of, let's try and avoid commenting too much on the fluidity of the now, because so many things aren't in place for us to be able to form concrete and valid conclusions. So our best bet is to wait and report on things that have happened in the past, where we can piece the jigsaw together so it looks a lot more like it's supposed to look. And I guess, yes, and that brings to the fore, the essence of the journalists now who are, as you talked about earlier, who are trying to make or trying to establish or trying to reinforce the careers they already have. And I've just to finish off, I think we have this issue this morning with Robert Peston, who reported that the French ambassador had flown out of Afghanistan, and the French had then had to come back, and it's just been reported by Full Fact, because Full Fact of when they're asked to investigate things by the public, they tend to focus on those things, and they're reporting that this isn't true at all, that he remained in Kabul, that he nearly flew out of the green zone. But people like Robert Peston are in that position where they've got to be seen to be delivering news because that's their job, and like you said earlier, often the news that they are leaking out, or they're putting out on their Twitter accounts, etc., to the public is incorrect.
Yeah. So in fact, I think it was quite interesting that one of the worst developments as far as honest news is concerned, I think, over the last sort of 30 odd years, is the development of 24-hour news programs. Yeah. They've got to fill immense amounts of airtime with very little real news that is kind of known and certain. So it's endless speculation, endless guessworks, endless corrections, endless, oh, we've had this breaking, but we're not sure. Let's get a comment on whether that thing that may or may not be true is relevant by somebody who clearly doesn't know anything about the situation. And they're just filling airtime. And so one of the things I say to everyone is, if you ever want to understand the world, you've got to stop watching BBC News and Current Affairs. You've got to stop reading mainstream newspapers. You've got to dig out the best reporting on the internet. But even worse than that, never ever watch 24-hour news channels. It's just pointless.
Yeah, and to finish off, Rod, thank you so much for this. And just to finish off, I mean, we are looking at a whole series of crimes that have taken place just in the last 2 decades or so. And at the helm of all of those crimes have been either presidents or prime ministers. And obviously in the shadows, the clandestine figures below them, there are so many of those people who are making sure that these crimes come to fruition, so to speak. But one of the big calls, just to finish off with, one of the big calls since the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, and the so-called weapons of mass destruction and the Dodgy Dossier, has been the call to get both Blair and Bush into The Hague to face up to the criminal activities that they obviously took part in, even though they might deny it. And yet, of course, within the world in which we live, that is never going to happen.
Yes.
So just the justice for some, but there's certainly not justice for others. And that in itself is a problem, isn't it? Because these people are doing things, as you rightfully identified, often on behalf of corporations, on behalf of lobbyists, on behalf of the arms industry, etc. And none of those organizations have any wish for their participation in these crimes to be exposed in the court of law. So there's no clamor from really powerful organizations for justice. It's only the public who's squealing for justice, and only a small portion of them in itself. So without accountability, this ain't going to end.
I agree entirely. And in fact, one of the things we'll talk about in a future presentation is relates to something you've talked about, how democracy doesn't seem to be working. So in fact, in Britain and America, I actually write that now we have the illusion of democracy. Superficially on the surface, it looks like a democratic system where you have a vote once every few years. But in practice, on the issues that matter, which tends to be foreign policies and the power of the 1%, corporate power particularly, your vote makes no difference at all. And we don't have genuine democracy. There is no way for an ordinary person to get their voice heard or to influence policy at the moment. And we are going to have to, over time, work together to see how we can change the system to make it a functioning democracy. But you're absolutely right. When a democracy is not working, you get the people at the top who actually become immune from any sort of legal sense. So again, you've got war criminals, but actually you've got corporate criminals who the vast majority of the time just get a slap on the wrist and so on. And you realize that something I'm writing at the moment, which is, you know, what do we have when you've got a situation where the criminals make the law? Yeah. Now, people might think that this is a bit extreme for me to be saying that the criminals make the law, but that is actually what we've got in Britain and America today. And it's something we need to be much more aware of. We've got to talk about this because we have to change the system so that the law applies to everyone and we can hold powerful people to account.
And that's a brilliant place to finish. Thank you so much, Rod, again, for coming on 10 by 6.
Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. We'll see you very, very soon. Thank you.
Bye.